Hello, everybody. It's great to see, as Eliot put it, so many familiar names and so many unfamiliar names too. I'm Mark Lipovetsky, professor of Russian Studies at Columbia University. And today it is my extreme pleasure to talk and introduce to you, in case you don't know, my very good friend, my co-author and colleague and teacher in many ways, and by all standards, the wittiest Slavist alive, Eliot Borenstein. And Eliot, as you may not know, is a professor of Russian and Slavic studies and senior academic convener for the Global Network of New York University. He is the author of 4 books to date: Men Without Women, Masculinity and Revolution in Russian Fiction, 1917-1929. We know the 2001 Edsel Book Prize. Overkill, Sex and Violence in Contemporary Russian Popular Culture, winner of the 2008 AWSS Book Prize. Plots Against Russia, Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism, one of the 2020 Vucinich Book Prize, and the most recent Pussy Riot, Speaking Punk to Power, 2020. We will talk about 2 latest books, but all of you certainly know Eliot also as a very active member, and I would say, as they say in Russian now, influencer of Russian speaking, and not only Russian speaking, Slavic speaking community. And we all remember how Eliot organized the group that started sharing ideas about teaching on Zoom, and how much this group taught all of us who were moving to Zoom. And indeed, these were all of us, right? And also in the I would say pretty dark and days of the early pandemic, Eliot ran the lecture series about Russian internet memes, and that was 17 lectures, absolutely hilarious, and at the same time absolutely scholarly, innovative, each and every one of them. And that was a very important sign of, I would say, sustainers of our profession, and Eliot took this very important intellectual role upon himself at that moment, and I'm very grateful to him personally for that. We will be talking, as I said, about his 2 latest books, Plots Against Russia, and the book on Pussy Riot. Please feel free to enter your questions or comments into chat. You can do this both when you are watching us on Zoom, or when you're watching us on YouTube. We will try to address these questions either during the first half, when we will be talking just the 2 of us, or during the second half, when we will open the floor for these very questions. So if we have some sort of log of questions already waiting for Eliot to address them, that would be quite interesting. Let's talk first about Plots Against Russia. I personally find this book absolutely exciting and exhilarating, and I seriously cannot think of another book that can be used by specialists in different fields of Russian studies. It is equally interesting for those who are exploring Russian culture, and for those who are trying to understand Russian politics, because you are exactly at the crossroad between cultural studies, literary analysis, discursive analysis, and political analysis. And you have created an amazing map of popular mythologies, conspiratorial, of course, which are constitute both the core of the culture and the core of the political agenda, surprisingly. In certain ways, and I'm here telling something that you already know, but our listeners may not, right? And in certain ways, this book continues your Overkill, Sex and Violence in Contemporary Russian Popular Culture, because in the Overkill, you have introduced to the English-speaking world the concept of bespredel, of some kind of the lawless chaos, right? That lots of fiction and cultural production of the 90s have been reflecting, right? And you are arguing that conspiracy theories that are at the center of attention in your plots against Russia are alternative to bespredel, right? They're sort of the force that brings order into chaos. We certainly are not very happy with this order, but the intention behind these narratives is clearly anti-bespredel, anti-chaotic, right? And from this standpoint, I find this explanation very, very reasonable. From this point, we can understand why internet and development of social networks have enhanced the development of conspirology all over the world, right? Because internet sort of challenges the sense of order. Internet presents some kind of the chaotic and uncontrollable world to which the culture and individuals want to respond with certain conspiracy theories. But recently, famous French philosopher Jacques Rancière published a blog, "The Fools and the Wise," published it on the Verso Press site, and I'm very grateful to your former student and our joint colleague Daniel Lederman, who brought this blog to our attention. And Rancière argues there that conspiracy theories are not reflective of gullibility as we are used to believe. On the contrary, they reflect critical thinking. Of course, we may say it's a perverse critical thinking, but critical thinking nevertheless, right? Because the impetus behind every conspiracy theory is that you are telling us this, but we know what you are hiding, right? What is displayed in plain sight is generally there to cover up the truth, and conspiracy theory sort of reveals this truth. So you are writing in your book about Russophobia, about anti-liberal and anti-political correctness sentiment. You're writing about the various zombification concepts that travel along cultural field, right? Against anti-Ukrainian narratology, so to speak. And of course, the usual suspects, homophobia, anti-Semitism, are also present in this panorama. So how do these narratives fit Rancière's suggestion that these are reflections of critical thinking? Maybe you disagree. Do you agree with this? Do you disagree? So what do you think about that?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you for the overly generous introduction. If it weren't for my wonderful filter on Zoom, you'd see that I'm blushing. And also for bringing up Rancière and for my former student introducing to that. And I'm just so glad that I had the opportunity to introduce Daniel Lederman to you, so that you would have the opportunity to learn from him. But as for the Rancière quote, I think Rancière is, I don't completely agree with him. I think I would not accept the terminology critical thinking. I think what conspiracy theorists are engaged in is systematic thinking and skeptical thinking, but I don't believe it rises to the level of critical thinking, because at least in my most rosy view of what critical thinking is or should be, critical thinking is also quite willing to examine its own foundations, and is willing to correct itself when it runs into information, data, opinions that turn out to be convincing, but not what you originally believed in. Whereas most of the time with conspiracy theory, it is the very careful, systematic marshaling of a great deal of information and putting it into a lot of categories and overwhelming you with what looks like so much organized stuff, right? I mean, there's no one who's better at citation than conspiracy theorists, but what they're citing is crap. So you have the structure that looks like conspiracy theory, but built on a foundation of, built on a really unstable foundation of stuff that is really untenable, but is left unexamined.
I see, but you write yourself about the continuity between sort of Soviet ways of thinking and processing of very limited information, right?
Right.
And today's way of processing of excessive amount of information, despite supposed censorship, the amount of information is huge nevertheless, right? You provide different explanations, but don't you think that the main source of conspirological thinking in Russia are what we used to call intelligentsia?
Yes.
So, those who are taking or used to take various ideological statements with, as you said, very, very serious skepticism. So how did it happen that this skepticism became so perverted that it doesn't address, as you very well put, its own foundations? How do you explain that?
That's an excellent question. So in two parts. One, the lack of information versus the surplus of information. That actually, I think, it goes back to all the explanations about how postmodernism arises at the same time in the Soviet Union as in the United States. That an official monolithic single channel of information relativizes everything else, so you don't differentiate. A huge flow of contradictory information also makes everything relative, so there's no real stable foundation for truth. When it comes to the intelligentsia, what I would say about that, this is one of those areas where I'm comfortable saying something aloud, but I wouldn't know how to put it into writing because I wouldn't be able to find the pseudoscientific sources to back it up. So this is really completely anecdotal. And I'm ready to have it torn apart. But this goes back to my interactions with members of the intelligentsia going back to the 80s. And what always struck me as, ironically, I think a kind of mirror image Soviet way of thinking, of a very categorical way of talking about the world, talking about their beliefs, of insisting on putting everything into certain boxes, and on finding absolute truth and absolute rightness, in a way that seems, totalitarian is an extreme word for it, but seems really authoritarian in its ways of making an argument. And if you combine that with a sort of syncretic impulse based on the idea that what you're being told officially isn't really true, this kind of intelligentsia version of dvoyeveria, where you have your science and you have all the folk crap that you believe in, and people just the sheer amount of stuff I was always told by people as facts, that wasn't always really amazed me. And so my problem with everything I've said is I can't back this up at all. It may resonate with you, or may not. It may resonate. It might be something particular about the Shizyatiki, the generation of the 60s, with whom I know you're rather familiar. But it's a very unsystematic answer.
Well, I understand what you mean, and I can say that probably I'm guilty as charged as well. But I have invented, and I'm grateful to you, citing this article of mine, the concept of the ITR culture,
Yes.
right? The culture of scientific technological intelligentsia, and I think that this sort of let's put it in the plain language, binarist thinking, right, is very much typical for the attempts to sort of apply scientific concepts to the sphere that goes beyond science, right, and beyond sort of hard matters. But on the other hand, in your book, you constantly refer to American conspirology, right, and we certainly are aware of the role it plays in today's American culture and politics, right?
Yeah, just a little.
And so here comes the question about similarities and differences between Russian and American conspirologists? How would similarities are obvious, right? Поднять Россию с колен, make America great again, right? The same enemies, politically correct liberals, gays, LGBTQ, Black Lives Matters, all these objects sort of connect a lot, ultralight in the United States, right, and Russian, not necessarily ultralight, right? We'll talk about this. It's a much broader consensus around these conspirological theories and this sort of figures of the enemies. But so where do you see similarities and where do you see differences?
Well, as you said, there are loads of similarities, in part because, as a lot of scholars of conspiracy theory have long shown, it's hard for a conspiracy theory to die. It just goes off and interbreeds with another conspiracy theory, and they all come together. And so eventually, unless a conspiracy theory is so hyper-local that it doesn't make sense out of its own context, it's going to spread. So conspiracy theorists around the world can all talk about chemtrails and things like that, and the lizard people, and so anal probes, all that stuff. It's great. But I think the cardinal difference between the general trends of conspiracy theory in America and the general trends of conspiracy theory in Russia have to do with one basic ideological distinction between the sort of general popular currents of political thought in the States and popular political thoughts in Russia. And that is, for the most part, American conspiracy theories are anti-state. The state is the enemy. It's very hard for a lot of conspiracy theorists, I think it's very hard for them to conceive of the state in a way that is not the enemy. Whereas obviously in Russia, the state is the hero. The state is this, basically it's all about the state from the state's point of view, and also from the point of view of a lot of conspiracy theorists, right? Even if they don't trust the person in power, statehood in whatever form is hugely important. So that is a point at which they really thoroughly diverge. But you have to really pay attention to see it.
That's a very interesting point, an exciting point, and probably you are right. Although, so what would contradict to what you said is, in your book you show very well, and I find this sort of another very important aspect, that you show how conspiracy theories are not only demonizing the other, which we would expect to see there, right? But it also are shaping very actively the image of the self, the image of Russia, in your case, right? And you show that the image that appears as a result of overlap of various conspiracy narratives is the image of Russia as the victim of the aggression from all over the world, sort of eternal victim, right? An eternal savior of the world, very much, I would say, Christian image, and also Russia that has to protect its borders, which are constantly violated by different forms of penetration, right? So sort of physical, sexual, discursive, etc., right? If we are looking at the image that American conspiracy theorists create, I would say it's opposite, right? They sort of sustain the image of America as the top of the world, of the best country of the world, that doesn't need the rest of the world, that's absolutely self-sufficient and can exist on a separate planet, right, if necessary. Yeah. So how do this anti-government and pro-government approaches connect with these aspects of conspiracy?
Right. So absolutely, for notions of American greatness, it's very much about not even bothering to need to compare yourself to others and having the right to intervene wherever you want, though probably you shouldn't, because the right wing has gotten fairly anti-interventionist. There is some crossover in terms of protecting the borders, obviously, as we can see with the whole border wall stuff and all of that. But what is missing, I think, largely from American conspiratorial thought is that compensatory element of needing to prop up the greatness of your country by showing it to be a victim, right? Russia, I hate saying Russia this way, like I can talk about one Russia, but discursively, Russia needs to be constantly reassuring itself and proving itself of its own greatness, whereas America doesn't even realize it might need to do that. America just bumbles along completely cluelessly that other people might not like it, and if people don't like it, then they can't understand why. But Where there's a similarity is, perhaps ironically, that the right-wing conspiracy types in the United States, no matter how anti-globalist they are, their concerns are such that their notion of the victim of conspiracy is actually a bit more cosmopolitan than the Russian notion, because the real victims of conspiracy theory from the point of view of like mainstream American conspiracy theory are white Christians.
Mhm.
And so you have white Christians outside of America too. Of course, America is the promised land for white Christianity and all that, but that's also where you get that bizarre preoccupation on the alt-right with Russia as another great homeland of whiteness, forgetting everybody who's not white in Russia, not understanding the ways in which whiteness translates, doesn't entirely map well on Russia. But I think the attempt to understand Russia in terms of white Christianity on the part of alt-right conspiracy theorists in the United States says a lot about what the subject, I suppose, of the conspiracy theories are in the United States as opposed to in Russia. It's not that in Russia there aren't people concerned with whiteness, or more I would say with non-white people. But the racialization of it is a particular preoccupation in America, and it would be put in different terms from by their xenophobic counterparts in Russia.
Mhm. Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. Although I want to return later to the question about race in Russian
Sure.
conspirological imagination, so to speak. But here comes another important question. So basically, we are talking already about the influence of cultural discourses onto politics, right? Because the main gist of material in your book is the analysis of books, films, internet memes, and blogs, right? That you have processed. I don't know how many, thousands probably of titles. So you're the only person who read all this material, maybe at least in this hemisphere, for sure, right? But and on the other hand, we have politics, right? We can imagine at least how this popular mythology travels into the instances of power when there is representational democracy, right? So we can imagine. I'm not saying that it's exactly how it happens, but at least this mechanism is obvious, right? When we are looking at Russia in the 21st century, we are seeing increasing authoritarianism, right, and increasing isolation of political elites from whatever their base is or could be, right? So how do these mythologies travel into the political agenda in Russia? How do you see this happening there?
Mm-hmm. Well, it starts out on the fringes, as it does pretty much everywhere. So when I started looking at the stuff in the 90s, it was in fact it was originally a chapter of Overkill that didn't quite fit. So I took it out and made a new book out of it. There's a chapter that I did the same thing with Plots Against Russia after. Actually, there's a chapter going to the next book.
Mhm.
But when I started, it was very much about the fringes, and I was really kind of concerned that I'm paying too much attention to fringe phenomena and that I'm going to be distorting the image of Russia because I'm so preoccupied with all this wacko stuff. And by the time I finished the book, I had no problem with that. The Russian political culture took care of that concern for me. Thank you, I guess. And what happened was the people I was reading in the newspapers that would pick up in the metro station in the 1990s, by the first century, the first decade of the 20th century, were starting to appear on television. They were certainly all over the internet, and by the second decade, they were all over television. Right, so there's a move from the margins very much into the world of the media. Now the question is then, how do they get there, and why are they there, and what are they there for? And a lot of people, I think, have quite correctly talked about how there is too much emphasis on, say, identifying one or two particular thinkers who are exerting influence on Putin and Putinism, like Dugin in particular, right? Like, and saying this is what it's all about. And someone like Dugin has gotten a much larger platform in the past several years, no doubt, and has an influence because his main book is being taught in academies throughout the Russian Federation. But what it's more about, I would say, is opportunism. Opportunism on the part of the regime. Well, a couple of things. One, the sort of general patriotic, chauvinistic leanings of a lot of the conspiracy theories worked very well with some of the agenda of the regime right now. But also, as the years have gone by, I think the people in the Kremlin, and certainly the people running the media, have found conspiracy theorists and conspiracy theories useful. They're useful for mobilizing opinion. They're certainly useful for mobilizing opinion when it comes to questions like Ukraine. And they're useful for muddying the water so that you can't figure out what the truth is. So, you know, like with the airliner shut down over Ukraine, like have 10 different versions of it. So then you think, I don't know, what is it? And even I have to say, like, you know, I'm convinced it was just a mistake that's, you know, these idiot Russian separatists in Ukraine shot it down by accident. And then on social media said, oh my God, I shot down a plane. That totally makes sense to me. But when I'm reading all the stuff, I realize, you know, the Dutch released a report, the Russians released a report, and I'm not an avionics expert. How am I supposed to decide which one I believe? And it's all a matter of larger context. But if you're subject to having a bunch of different stories told, you're just going to throw up your hand and say, I don't know what's really happening. So that's why when I talk about, in the first chapter, I think when I talk about the nature of conspiracy theory in general, I argue that it's important to try to get away from trying to figure out if someone believes what they're saying. I mean, sometimes it's useful to know if someone believes what they're saying, but when a broadcaster on state television or someone working for Putin drops some conspiracy theory, they may believe it in general or they may not, but as a speaking subject of that sentence at that point, they are functioning as a believer in conspiracy theory and putting that out there to serve a particular purpose. And that it would be a mistake to see the entire Putinist regime as one big conspiracy theory. It's multiple conspiracy theories, but more to the point, you don't have to be all into a conspiracy theory to partake of it and get some use out of it. You can believe a little bit, use it a little bit now, don't really think about it another time, and be completely opportunistic. I would say there's only one profound conspiratorial element of the worldview put out by the Kremlin that I think is long-term and sustaining, and that is the Western world hates us.
Yes.
That's the foundation of everything. Russophobia.
The Western world and especially America, of course, right?
And especially America, right? Yeah. So Russophobia as a justification of everything. Not that there isn't such a thing as Russophobia, but framing Russophobia in these conspiratorial terms is so useful. Yes. And then turns everything you don't like into false flag operation. That's as consistent as they need to be.
Yeah, that. You're right. You're absolutely right. But let me ask you one more question about the sort of politics, and then we move to more pleasant subjects. So from this description of the situation, so the book is published in 2019. So obviously it has been written prior to this moment, right? And nowadays in 2020, 2021, after Navalny affair, we are seeing certain political changes, right? And what was on the fringes and what was sort of in the discursive palette now. So if you seen what how the state media and for instance, the members of the State Duma reacted to Navalny's arrest, it sounds like quotations from the newspapers of the 1930s, early 1950s, right? Navalny as the agent of 3 intelligence services, in other words, 2 intelligence services. So the number of intelligence services differs on, and we see it sort of all the way through. And of course, it is the conspiratorial narrative. My question is, if this is just the radicalization of what has been present in Russian political culture already, or is it some new phase or new development of what you are describing in the book?
I think it's an intensification of what's already there. And I think the biggest risk for the regime in doing this is, and the thing that people like Navalny and people around him are so good at taking advantage of, is how routine it starts to look. right? Oh yes, of course Navalny works for the intelligence services, and there are going to be people out there who believe that already and are ready to believe it. But on its own, it isn't necessarily a convincing argument. And what I think is so brilliant about the opposition right now, and that goes back to 2012, goes back to Pussy Riot, goes back to all the slogans, is understanding that perhaps given the constraints on speech and protest right now, the best way to oppose this stuff is not to go into a sort of 60s dissident style proclaiming, this is wrong, this is the truth. But that moment on I guess on TikTok when I can't remember which a doctor, I believe, connected to Navalny is being her apartment's being searched and she's playing Beethoven on the piano. Have you seen this one?
No.
The door opens, she's playing Beethoven on the piano, she's playing for Elisa, and they're talking about the obelisk, and she keeps playing for Elisa. And then when she's done, they're talking about the obelisk, and she says, you could applaud. And they say other people are going to applaud you. And then she does the thing where she says, no, I'm not going to sign anything, I don't have my lawyer here. But stuff like that makes, it turns the officials into idiots from Monty Python, right? And that is wonderful. And refusing to argue on their own terms and make the representatives of the regime seem limited, unimaginative, stupid, is, I don't know how effective it is in the long term, but I think it's the cleverest thing and the most powerful tool that they have, to show, oh, here we go again. Yes, of course, Navalny is an agent. Yes, you're inspecting me. Yes, and this is how seriously I take it. Please hold on while I finish my piano solo.
So basically, you are saying that the old and well trained methodology of stop as a form of political resistance is still more than relevant.
Much more than relevant, because I think back when in the heyday of Stiop, I don't think it got the same sort of exposure that it's getting now, right?
Oh, yes,
So I think for a lot of people, this is the first time they're seeing Stiop being used so consistently, over the past several years, still being used so consistently against the seriousness of power.
That's absolutely correct. But on the other hand, your book gives a lot of opposite examples, right? For example, and let's talk about literature, the favorite thing to do. For example, one of my favorite parts of the book is where you introduce the genre of liber punk, and I always address my students to this chapter because indeed this is a very, very useful description of the new genre, of the genre of sort of cyberpunk dystopian narrative that uses the staples of what is mislabeled, I guess, political correctness, right, or liberal thought, as the sources of some kind of police state, rigid disciplinary regime, right? And you show how this genre appears on the fringes, exactly, in the mass literature, popular literature, that is having very, very peculiar readership. But now, why I am sending my students to this description, because, for example, the entire genre of Pelevin in the 2000s, 2010s is exactly liber punk.
Yeah.
Snuff, well translated into English and very much sort of publicized, is a perfect example of liber punk. I Fuck 10, the novel that received Andrei Biel, very, very sort of highbrow liberal prize, right, as the best novel, is also a clear example of liberal punk. Right? And for us, for you and me, we know each other for almost 30 years, Pelevin was always one of these favorite postmodernist critics who are using stop and irony and various forms of comedy, postmodernist comedy, to exactly undermine various political, conspirological, etc. concepts. I cannot say that he is undermining conspirological theories in his latest novels. He's reinforcing them with irony, but irony is very much instrumental. So how do you explain that?
Well, with Pelevin, I don't, it's not like I could have predicted this in the 1990s, but looking back, it's not as much of a shock as it first seemed, right? That the hostility, there's a fair amount of hostility towards liberalism there early on. And I think I see this with a lot of writers, not just in Russia, really anywhere, that as they get older, they get crankier, frankly, and get less subtle about expressing their political views. So, Pelevin's still ironic, and he was never all that subtle, but he's not at all subtle right now. By any means. His connection to Liber-Punk, the best part of his connection is that he writes Liber-Punk better than any of the Liber-Punk people do, and he doesn't use the term. But he's also an example of the complete mainstreaming of anti-PC discourse. The problem with which is always accepting a right-wing understanding of this demon of PC as this thing that does not change, that is bad from start to finish, and never actually, interrogating what this is all about and whether it actually exists in this particular form. So I looked around for dystopias throughout the world that are based on, the horrors of liberalism. They do exist, but Liber-Punk and people associated with it have really run with it in a way that kind of makes sense given Russian political culture. I think for a lot of people, for a lot of liberals in the West, imagining liberalism becoming a repressive dystopia is kind of difficult to see, but it's based on what I would say is either an accidental or deliberate mischaracterization of everything about minority rights, minority rights, actually, or about anything really to do with minorities. That every question of minority rights is a zero-sum game, and it's taking things away from the majority. And anytime you give people rights, you're taking it away, and you might be forcing them to do the exact same thing. So everybody's gonna have to get gay married. All like that actual commercial. Basically, of Liber-Punk in the commercial for Putin with the guy waking up and finding out that he has to marry some gay guy because his partner left him, and that's the law. I don't think that was kind of a messy answer to your question, I'm afraid.
No, it's a very, very good answer. But you didn't predict Pelevin's evolution, but you did predict Tatiana Tolstoy's evolution, because you were one of the first ones who took seriously her apparently joking attacks against PC in the mid-90s, right? So from what you wrote back then and what you wrote in this book, we can easily sort of see her evolution to this openly racist statements that we all have pleasure to read on Facebook. And here comes the question. So for Pelevin, I can understand, not justifyingly understand, but understand the sort of the logic of the era, because first of all, as many Russian intellectuals do, they sort of identify PC with the power discourse. Why it is not the power discourse, right? It's sort of the it's not institutionalized in many ways, right? And especially under Trump, it's silly to speak about this as institutionalized discourse, right? And therefore they perceive it as a form of censorship, and that's why they sort of mistake it for censorship. So here we can at least reconstruct certain logic, but to reconstruct Tolstoy's racism and to reconstruct the aggressive reaction towards BLM among big part of Russian intelligence, both living in Russia, both living even in the United States, that's something not easy for conceptualization. So how would you deal with that?
Well, I guess I was never surprised by Tolstoy at any particular moment, I guess because both in her writing and certainly her public persona, I always had this sense of this lust, that there's a mean-spiritedness about her that I always felt. And I think part of it is that when I first encountered her comments about PC and leftism and all that, it was actually in English language media, with her as the great Russian writer here talking about how bad things are, right? And in fact, what Tolstoy sounded like actually was she sounded like any emigre intellectual writing a Novoe Ruskoe Slovo. She sounded
non-existing like, anymore, by the way.
Well, that's I would say that's wonderful, but everything that's replaced it is so much worse. But that what you in a way what I see with that is really the same sort of processes that I would see with the tendencies of the Russian-speaking emigration from the 70s on to embrace right-wing politics here in the United States. So when you see it in Russia, it's like, oh yeah, this is like in Brighton Beach. This is like what I'm seeing elsewhere. This is a familiar reaction to political liberalism, to leftism, to discussions of minority rights. It's largely the same processes.
But Tolstoy and Brighton Beach are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And Tolstoy satirized Brighton Beach and Runglish in the same way as she satirized PC. So it's not exactly the same.
No, I know, but I think Tolstoy and Brighton Beach are on the opposites of the spectrum only in terms of taste. But not in terms of outlook or a kind of way of taking pleasure in a sort of happy right-wing contrarianism. I think she's a mirror image of Brighton Beach. She's Brighton Beach that dresses better
and read more
and
and writes better. That's a problem
and writes better. But you know, as I actually said this on Facebook, you know, looking back on it, well, of course, her one novel is a futuristic dystopia where we have the feudal system. I think there's a lot for her in the feudal system to really find common ground with.
Yeah. All right.
Sorry.
So no, that is fine. That's great. I was just wondering. So in your book, race is only a part of the sort of this anti-liberal narrative, right? Race is not singled out as, for example, LGBTQ, right? Or singled out as Jewish conspiracy, for example. However, now we are seeing how in Russian cultural milieu and, of course, correspondingly in political milieu, race is becoming as important as in the American right-wing discourse. How do you explain this? Only by the mirroring, or there are some other factors?
Well, I think what's happening in part is terminological, and in part this attention in the United States, because race qua race, calling it race and talking about race was not the big thing among the right and conspiracy theories in Russia. However, what was and remains important is questions about migration, right? And migration is wrapped up often in race, in culture, in language, in Islam, and I do talk in the book about how people like you know, the guy who does Военная тайна would go on about not about both LGBTQ dangers and the dangers of migration, and how Western women are marrying Muslims because they seem hot and macho, not like the weak men in Europe. And Europe is, so demographics, right? Europe is dying out, which means the white race is dying out, but it's not usually put in terms of the white race, just as so much in Russia. Europeans means what? I mean, Europeans and whites occupy similar spaces, right? So I mean, you see that from from apartment rental ads. They don't say whites only; they say Europeans only, right? And the result is the same, but the conceptualization is different. But then when you have Black Lives Matter, well, it's in the title, right? It's not non-European lives. And this is where you have such a huge event, such a huge phenomenon going on in the United States that on the one hand fits in with a long tradition, going back to the Soviet Union, of pointing to American racism as the weak spot to show, hey, you're not so great either, lynchings and so on and so forth. Absolutely. But that those same accusations could easily be made by people who also would say openly racist things in the next sentence, right? Given how sympathetic so many people in the Russian media, blogosphere, people like Ksenia Sobchak, right, are to any sort of discussion of the dangers of migration, the dangers of Muslim, the dangers of basically the non-white peoples, then it's very easy to adopt a racist or white self-defensive notion about Black Lives Matter, and also project some leftover Soviet colonialist notions about the non-Russians, non-Europeans having to know their place. But with the response to Black Lives Matter, though, I think is the point when all of these undercurrents of anti-Black racism in Russian culture that you can see online really easily, you can see in all sorts of places, have had something to coalesce around.
Yeah, and I see here, of course, some form of translation of the cultural racism that is still very prevalent among Soviet, post-Soviet diasporic intelligentsia, right? So cultural racism suggests the sense of one's own superiority in terms of culture, and it's easily translatable into racial terms. And
and this is also very familiar to me from back when I used to work with immigrants in the late 80s and 1990s from the Soviet Union. The moment I would dread would be any encounter between them and Black Americans, because I was just like, oh, please don't say something, please don't say something. And then thankfully they didn't speak English. But then more often than not, they'd say something absolutely horrible. And I would say something along the lines of, you should just, think about everything people have said about Jews, because most of these people coming over are Jews. And imagine and just think about what people are saying about African Americans the same way. It's, oh no, you can't make a comparison at all. And so none of this sadly surprises me. People came over and brought their colonialist attitudes with them, projected them quite comfortably onto the American racial context, and went forward.
And not asking questions about the foundations of their own discourse, as you exactly put it in the beginning, right? So right. I may have more questions about your book, and I'm sure that our audience will have more questions. There are 7 questions already in the questions answers, but I will move on to your latest book, most recent book, Pussy Riot, Speaking Punk to Power. And I love this subtitle because it basically, of course, subverts the expected narrative of speaking truth to power, right? And I love how you, although this book is sort of, it belongs to the series that intends to speak about contemporary Russia in the non-professional language, so to speak, right? Popularized presentation of contemporary culture. And I think that you set a new standard for this genre, which is a very difficult genre. We all understand it, because on the one hand, indeed, you write in the language that an undergraduate student would clearly understand, right? On the other hand, you cover lots of grounds, right? You contextual and analytically, right? You speak about the text of the punk prayer, the presentation, the performance, the video art, right? About political rhetorics, about feminism in Soviet, post-Soviet Russia, about attitudes to the church, to the Russian Orthodox Church, about the concept of the fool. You even find the place to create micro portraits of such under your pen, comical, but they're maybe pretty scary figures like Ksenia Sobchak or Pyotr Mamontov, right? The author of programs against Pussy Riot. And you are never sentimental, but you are obviously very much interested in your subject, and you tell the story of Pussy Riot and the historical performance very well. I think so. So I will recommend this book to anyone who wants to understand contemporary Russia. So one question is about the long-term effect of the punk prayer, right? So 9 years passed since that moment, almost precisely 9 years, because it was in February, as we remember, right? So now, from today's perspective, what was the effect of the punk prayer of Pussy Riot as the cultural and political phenomenon in Russian history, I would say?
Well, I think the effect it was trying to have was first and foremost to start some serious dialogue about the interrelationship of church and state in Russia at the time, a dialogue that the people running the trial absolutely did not want to have, and that the people making the films about it in Russia did not want to have, and ultimately. It's a conversation that people in the opposition and liberals are having, but they already were. So, as is often the case, sort of Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle to talk about socialism, but what he got is got people really disgusted with how their meat was being made, and that was the change that was that ended up happening, not socialism. The biggest effect of Pussy Riot was really the trial of Pussy Riot and their ultimate release, and I think showing, whether they wanted to or not, the state ended up giving a lot of attention to these women who were being demonized again and again, but ended up giving them opportunity to show that they're not scared, right? And every opportunity, and look, with Navalny now, it amazes me, right? Every opportunity that we have to see these people who are, nothing in comparison to the apparatus of the state, laughing, right? Laughing on camera, smiling and saying, I don't, this is all nonsense. You're putting me in prison. This is nonsense. That started before Pussy Riot, but making that a part of, the record, right? And making that part of something that continues to this day, right? With Navalny, that is hugely important. On a smaller level, it got the women of Pussy Riot, well, the two who ended up, staying in prison, they were already politically active, obviously, no question there. But the prison experience got them interested in a whole set of political problems they weren't really thinking of, like in particular prisons and also media. So what I think is wonderful about Pussy Riot, one of the many things I think is wonderful of these women of Pussy Riot, is that is how flexible they actually were and are in having an overall agenda, an overall idea of what they want, but being willing to change the form of what they do, to change the focus of their everyday operations, and to really get the most out of their own presence and interaction with a question, with a phenomenon as they can, right? They didn't start out to be prison activists, but they're in prison and they understand it. They didn't start out to set up a media organization, but they saw it, and they're, in that way, they're really a model of an incredible bricolage, like an incredible improvisational opposition that is really admirable.
Yeah, it's a very good idea of improvisational bricolage opposition, and of course you're right. They presented a very interesting example of political behavior, of cultural political behavior. I would also say that they definitely changed the liberal agenda in Russia by making feminism a political concept, right? We seriously, you cited in your book, and I remember how you wrote about this immediately when it appeared, how Sobchak, when interviewing Samusevich, was laughing at the suggestion that they would be talking about sexism. Who would talk about sexism in their right mind? And lots of liberal politicians back then were saying that okay, let them go. You should just slap them on the low body parts. Let's put it this way, all right, and let them go without even thinking how humiliating and how sexist is this term. Отпустите девочек, right? This has changed thanks to Pussy Riot, I think, right? Because they really made this kind of discourse, political discourse, and now it is a matter of political choice whether you say things like that or you stay away from things like that and say something opposite, right? So I think that is their contribution.
Absolutely, and I can't believe that I didn't start with that. Like, how did I forget feminism? I mean, it is the biggest.
You wrote about this.
I wrote about it. Yeah, okay, so I wrote about it. But right, I mean, it's worth remembering how astonishing it is that the biggest, most internationally noticed, scandalous moment of political opposition was done by feminists in Russia, right? Because it was such a dirty word, right? And I would not have, in 2011, I would not have thought there was much in the short term, much future for public feminist activism in Russia. There just didn't seem to be a space for it, and they've helped make that space. No question. And so, yeah, the way, at the very least, the way people, I don't know, on Deutsch, you know, on more liberal circles, are talking about gender is different, right? I mean, in the old days, you could be, and you could still see this, you could be a liberal opposition figure and then say 10 casual sexist things in the course of 2 sentences. And now I think people are thinking about it more. And they've also made, I talk about this in the book too. It's a delicate thing to talk about, but they've actually changed the visual image of feminism, right? Because there's a stereotype, the stereotype that very much lived, right? Of these feminists are ugly women who don't dress well, and they're feminists because they can't get men, and so on and so forth. And these are these beautiful, attractive young women who are feminists first and foremost. And that's, you know, I feel stupid saying that on the one hand, because of course you can be both, but it's worth mentioning how shocking that was, I think, to a lot of people to see that.
Exactly. And I remember how in the public discussion that was going around Pussy Riot in Russia, there were only a few voices who were resonating with their feminist agenda. Nobody else would notice it, right? So it is important. It is a long-term effect. In the book, you sort of coined the formula that I find very useful. That looking at various activities and various sort of turns of Pussy Riot's evolution within this 9 or more years, you emphasize that they're consistent in inconsistencies. Could you please unpack it a little bit?
Sure, and I should mention that before I wrote about this, Mikhail Yumpoyski said something similar in an article many years ago when all of this was going on. But that there is, especially in the Western media, but I think also in the Russian media, there is a desire to see them as one thing, right? Okay, so in the Western media in particular, they're a band, right? Like what band? I mean, I cracks me up that in interviews with Tolokonnikova recently, she's, you know, I'm learning how to sing. Like now you're learning how to sing. You could have, obviously it's not important, but you might have thought of that a decade ago, right? But that actually shows that wasn't what the whole project was about, right? Music was a means, right? And at the time also would occasionally have criticism, like, you know, people who were in the punk scene saying, well, we never saw them in the punk scene, they're misrepresenting the punk scene. And well, yeah, they are if you're looking at it from the point of view of the punk scene, but that's also a frame that is a bit too narrow. They adopted punk because they found it useful when they were looking at riot girls and so on and so forth, but not because they wanted to make a career in punk. And certainly you can certainly see with Tolakno before that, all the many things that she had done, right? I mean, if you wanted, if before they were unmasked, if you were to have people vote like who's the most likely woman to be an anonymous member of Pussy Riot, they would have voted for Tolakno. She was already pretty well known. So the West wants them to be a band and wants them to go on tour and keeps talking to them about them as a band. Well, not so much. They never tried to oversell their own ability to do music. The music was in service of something. The music was in service of actionism. The music was in service of performance art and of waking up people up politically. And after their imprisonment, that was not a realistic that was not going to be a way they're going to be able to get anything done, right? They'll just get arrested again, and they can't be anonymous. So they've turned to other things: institution building, drama, music videos, which I think are mostly kind of awful, but but they keep trying, and it's not because they betrayed punk. They were never married to punk. They were just sort of fooling around with punk. And the most punk thing about them is their willingness not to be punk. The most punk thing about them is their willingness to change and say, you don't have to tell me you can't tell me what I'm going to be.
Yes, you're right. And in your book, I like very much how soberly you write about the Tolokonnikov's experiments with music video, Tolokonnikova and Alyokhina's experiments with music video videos, right? Probably while reading your book, I was thinking that with their punk prayer as this synthetic form, as a matter of fact, right? They took such a high note and the resonance was so fantastic that it is impossible to go higher from that point. You can only go down. So that's some kind of the tragic flip side of this tremendous tremendous success. Sorry to say this about the event that ended with imprisonment, but it was a global success, of course.
Well, it's only tragic if that's what they keep trying to do, right? They've avoided the tragedy of it by going off to do other things. And the contrast between the punk prayer and also the other videos they released before it, and the stuff they've done that Nadia and Masha have done since is really stark, in part because in all the way up through punk prayer is a kind of special thing because of the way they had to film it in two different places, but really the videos were in service of capturing the event. It was about an event. And now the music videos, they're music videos, they're not events. And Nadia and Masha can't make events anymore. You know, you could run across the field and a soccer field, get arrested. That's not much. That doesn't really count much of it as an event. It's sort of like the problem that Sacha Baron Cohen had in being Borat. After a while, everybody recognizes Borat, though he got around it beautifully, I think, with his subsequent music film. But ultimately, you can't keep doing that same thing and have the same effects. So they're not even trying, exactly. Which is probably the smartest thing for them to do.
Yeah, that's right. So with the note of sadness, I want to move to another subject because again we can talk more, but we are already talking for an hour, sure. and have a feeling that our audience may get impatient. But I will still keep the ball on our side for a little while, because I want to talk with you about your projects in the making, and your website has at least the not only information but accessible materials about two projects which you have been developing for years. One is now called Soviet Self-Hatred, right, and it was called Russia's Alienations, and it includes this wonderful blogs and I would say articles, right? And I don't know if the audience can see this. I hope
they can see it. Yeah,
you can see it, right? Yeah. So you can see how the motifs of the Balabanov's films and Tolkien are being engaged into the analysis, and etc. And another project is Russian memes, with which those of us who followed you with your lecture course are also familiar, right? And that's is the material for your new book, Meanwhile in Russia. Could you please tell us, your fans, right, a few words about this
sure.
new project?
So the memes project, I did the lecture series in part, because it's something to do during COVID, but as a way to make myself get the work done on the book for the Russian short series. So I've actually finished it. It's being reviewed right now. It's another one of those short books, the same size as Pussy Riot, and it's an attempt to look at various categories of Russian memes and to think about what they mean, how they circulate in the culture, the ways in which internet memes and viral video in Russia are actually, I think, more closely associated with some urban folklore, more recent urban folklore traditions in Russia than you could say comparably in the West. The ways in which the memes travel, the ways in which they also take memes from the West, and then end, of course, on the memes of COVID. So that was just lots of fun. I just can't stress how much fun I had working on this project, and really how in love I am with the Russian shorts format. A 40,000 word book, I just would love, if I could keep doing that, I would just do it again and again and again. It's just really satisfying. So that's out with reviewers right now. I also finished a draft of this book, Marvel Comics in the 1970s. That's also out with reviewers right now, about the creation of a sense of inner life and subjectivity in Marvel Comics, in the weirdest Marvel Comics of the 1970s. And then there is this project that I grandiosely, in my own head, consider a trilogy, but no publisher wants to do a trilogy on on Russian culture. That's crazy. Called Russian Alienations. That was the blog that I started it out. And the first volume is now called Soviet Self-Hatred: The Secret Identities of Post-Socialism. That's also submitted, and I keep not getting it right. So I'm now once again trying to get the introduction into a form that I think will work better. But it's about the ways in which a mixed legacy of both pride and shame in Soviet culture and its uncoolness ends up, and also a sense of inferiority and having been conquered, at the end of the Soviet Union, ends up expressing itself through projection onto often imaginary segments of Russian society, like the New Russian, the Savok, and the Vatnik, and so on and so forth. And I also talk about a more seemingly positive, aggressive notion of a kind of weird Russian specificity, which is the appropriation of the orc from Tolkien and Warhammer and so on and so forth, as a positive image of Russianness. And that was originally in the Plots Against Russia thing. I'm already working on the follow-up, which is called Unstuck in Time, on the Soviet Uncanny, which is basically taking as a premise that people in the post-Soviet Union are sort of by default living kind of unstuck in time, in a time frame that never entirely makes sense after the collapse. And I'm connecting it with the popularity of this Russian science fiction genre of the popadancy, people accidentally travel to the past and interfere with it in really weird ways, with stories about being stuck in time loops, with imagination of a sort of Russian or Soviet imperial future and stuff like that. And I am writing a book on the HBO series The Leftovers, which about 2% of the that takes place 3 years after 2% of the Earth's population vanishes for reasons that no one will ever understand. So that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, that's hugely impressive, and you are moving away. So not moving away. You are combining Slavic studies with non-Slavic studies. Mm-hmm. So could you tell to your readers what is the secret of your prolificity? So you published 2 books in 2 years. You have 2 other books already in presses, so 3 books in presses, right? And you're writing two more books already. How do you do that? How many hours do you have in the day, in the working day?
Well, everything has always been sort of in process, and I just do a little bit every day of each of these things. 300 words of one project, a couple hundred words of another, and I'm reading and stuff. But really, I was not productive for many years. I sat around thinking I was writing a book that I never got around to until I started blogging for the All the Russias blog, and that really kind of released things. Between that and also, frankly, getting tenure, getting promoted to a professor, and now nothing I do matters at all. There's no pressure to, there's no real pressure to publish, and I could publish 10 more books and it won't make a difference. I'm not going to get promoted to super professor. I've been in this job for decades, and it's basically, I've just stopped giving a shit, right? And I believe I'm valued at my university. I'm very happy here, but I think I'm valued primarily as an administrator. And so that's my day job, and this is my fun hobby. And also, I don't know if I've submitted, to be frank, I don't know if I've submitted an unsolicited peer-reviewed journal article this millennium. I've just stopped.
No, you did. I know for a fact
unsolicited,
that you did.
Unsolicited, yes. Really?
No, that was solicited, of course.
See, there you go. I've gotten to the point where I don't want to write that way anymore, and I like writing in a different way, and it's working for me, and I don't have to care. I don't have to care that it doesn't fit in a particularly scholarly tone or a particular format, and I'm doing it really for myself. And it's absolutely liberating. And I feel like if there's one thing that could justify the ridiculousness, some of the ridiculousness of the entrenchment of the tenure system, and I think of this when I talk to my colleagues in Britain who have to report on every single thing they write and whether it's connected to what they're doing or not, is that this is to take advantage of this freedom. And so I found my utter irrelevance to be liberating.
Eliot, I can assure you that your importance for us all, and I would say for a big part of Slavic community and those who are
Thank you.
interested in our field is more than an administrator, and that we are reading your books as as eagerly as we are reading the new installment of your blog, as a matter of fact. So, I think that you really, at least in our field, introduced a new way of academic writing by making the blog some kind of the romance продолжением, right? The serialized publication of your new book, and you're doing this so successfully that's an example for the younger generation. Right?
It is with a couple caveats, though, right? I mean, I don't know if I would have done this before. I would not have done this before tenure. I am also not someone who's worried that someone's going to go out there and steal my ideas. But you could worry about that. I don't have to worry about someone saying, "Oh, maybe you shouldn't be blogging," right? So there's a certain stage of it. I think I'm getting away with it because of having attained a level of privilege. But once other people attain that level of privilege, I hope they can do it. It would be great.
I'm not sure that that's about privilege. And actually, if you have spelled out your idea in the blog, you already sort of copyrighted it, so nobody can steal it anymore.
I think so, but people, I've talked to some people. There are people out there who are just a little more concerned about that sort of thing than you and I are.
All right, so let's move to the questions, and
sure.
Can you open the Q&A?
Yeah, I can see them.
Yeah. So we have a number of questions from Yanis.
They're all from
Yanis. Tsagakis. I would leave it.
It's going to take me a while to read all of these.
to you what to answer. But while Eliot reading the questions, we have to read them and probably pick one or two to answer, because otherwise it will take all the time that we have. So let's begin with the first question. The abusive treatment of Russians by the so-called white supremacist West is by itself a refutation of the term white privilege, and the same applies to the Christian strand of Russian identity. That's a commentary rather than a question. And here is a question, two questions, right? Can conspiracy theories be resolved in the courthouses or in academic forums? What do you think?
No. I think you can't. It's very hard to talk someone out of a conspiracy theory. In the courthouses, I mean, I don't know how a courthouse. I think a court can punish someone for harassment that's related to a conspiracy theory, like what those people are doing to these poor parents of the Parkland the Sandy Hook kids who died, right? Or the family of Seth Rich suing Fox News for basically turning the entire right wing on them and having them, all this stuff. So it ends up being more about harassment and libel than it does about the theory itself. And then in terms of the academy, I never find much use in trying to debunk a conspiracy theory, because chances are you're dealing with someone who is pretty entrenched. And what the most convincing things I've read from people who talk about how you deal with a conspiracy theorist in your family, which is really a big topic nowadays, right? Thankfully, I don't have to deal with this, but it sounds really horrible, right? The stereotypical racist uncle or whoever, or Ariel Hochfeld's book about her ethnography of going out into Trump country several years ago. That what they suggest is sounds very snowflakey, right? Empathetic listening, and not addressing so much, this particular belief and that particular belief, but trying to get people to talk about what it is that concerns them. What are you afraid of? What are you worried about? And also to make sort of like you're a hostage, make yourself human along the way, and talk about things don't talk about the conspiracy theory itself, but make the emotional connection to the person, and then maybe over time you can help bring them away from some of this stuff. But it's something that requires deep engagement, and it's retail, it's not wholesale. So it's not encouraging, frankly.
Let's address one more question from Yanis Tserigakis, this is the question that you discuss in your book. This is about Pussy Riot, right? Do you think political correctness is applied with double standards? If Pussy Riot is desecrating a Christian church, it's considered artistic expression, free speech expression of dissent, criticism of sclerotic institutions, which of course is false, because if Pussy Riot were aiming at the above, they would have continued the activity by desecrating synagogues and more churches in the West where they found refuge, but they didn't. So in Russia, we heard a lot about what would happen if they try to do this in the mosque, for example.
Mosque, right? Exactly.
So I think it's important to address this question.
Yeah,
right?
I just disagree with the framing of the question, right? There's a reason that Pussy Riot didn't try to do this in the mosque. There's a reason they didn't go on to synagogue, because the focus of the activity here is not to fight against religion, and not to fight against a church as such. The focus was about a particular thing, which is about the patriarch standing in this church, and the church itself has a whole complicated history that I do talk about in the book, but I think many people are aware of. It's it's a very strange building. To draw attention to the way in which the church is instrumentalizing itself. The patriarch is instrumentalizing the church to prop up the regime. That is something very specific and political involving religion, and not actually about religion. Another thing, and they should, you should expect to be punished for this, certainly, right? A fine or something like that. You go, like the protesters who in the 1980s, as part of ACT UP, went into the would protest in the cathedral here in New York and get arrested. They expected to get arrested. They expected to get a fine, and they were ready for it. But you wouldn't necessarily expect 2 years in prison for it, right? If you're going to protest and you're going to violate a very specific misdemeanor level law, you can expect to be punished for violating that misdemeanor level law. The thing with the prosecution of Pussy Riot was how completely out of line the charges were from what usually happens when someone commits what is essentially an administrative violation.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And by the way, I might add that if I'm permitted, although of course, but just for the factual side of the things, we all know that after sort of appearing in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, they were taken to the police station and left without any charges. And they even returned to this police station because they forgot, they left behind their guitar, and then they took it from there. They started to be criminalized only when the video was published and its political meaning had become public. So desecration of the church was not the issue at all. It was not desecrated. There was no service. Right. They were just forced away from the church, and that was that. Right.
And most of the video was filmed elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So a question from Daria Yezerova. How would you say conspiracy theories in Russia vary across generations and or regions, if at all?
I don't know about regions. I have no access to that, so I can't speak to it. Generations, I have guesses, but I don't really have data for it. I mean, my gut feeling would be that there's a certain type of pensioner who is very receptive to a lot of conservative, backwards-looking ideas that are the heart of conspiracy theories. But I don't really know. I mean, that's the sort of empirical work that I think should be done, and I don't do.
Yeah, and of course the question of attitude of Orthodox Christianity and Church was a tiebreaker in many cases. Right? We have more questions from Yanis. Yanis says, for example, my question about Pussy Riot was not about them, but how they were used by Western media. It's not a question. I follow the Western media without double standards, not Pussy Riot. Do we have anything else? I don't see it in our ribbon, but maybe they're coming. So that's the negative side of the webinar.
Yeah,
We don't see our colleagues who otherwise would have addressed it. But since you're talking about conspiracy theories, we need to protect you from those who share conspiracy theories, right? So let's see if anything is coming.
My former student.
You have something?
Yes, my former student, Mr. Liederman.
He's asking a question.
Yes.
Okay.
How does one address the sense conspirologists have that they are the informed ones as pedagogues, etc.? Good luck. I don't know. I don't know how to talk people out of things because they're so incredibly convinced. And also, I'm lucky enough not to have that much first-hand experience with it. And I generally tend to walk away. I really just tend to walk away. I mean, my father used to invite Jehovah's Witnesses in to argue with them. I never saw the point. I don't really know, except to again go back to not addressing their ideas head on, because again, the empirical research that I find fairly convincing here is that in fact, the more you try to refute what a conspiracy theorist is saying, the more they dig in their heels that they're right, which is actually, I think, a general human reaction to things. I mean, that's one of the big problems here, right? Is that the form of dissemination of conspiracy theory goes back to your critical thinking question, right? It's like debate, it's like scholarship, it's like the way we build up an argument. So therefore, it's kind of like you're stuck in a sort of discursive quicksand. The more you move in it, the more you get caught up in it. And so I don't see how you debate your way out of it at all.
So the response is performative then.
Yeah,
as you suggested.
like in the case of the woman playing piano when her apartment is being searched. It's performative if you want to reject and make a statement. It's empathetic if you want to actually try to convince. So, for instance, let's say if this were a live talk. So at the Jordan Center, very often during our live talks, someone stand up and they turn out to be from Lyndon LaRouche's organization. Seriously. And then they start going off on their LaRouche's thing. And we're not going to start arguing with this person. You know, there's no arguing. In fact, what we just do is say thank you and move on. Now, if that LaRouche person there were my relative, whom I was very concerned about, then maybe I'd say, let's go for coffee. How are you doing? And not talk about the ideas, but really think of it as a mental health question, which is profoundly offensive, I understand, but would be how I would feel about it. But, you know, arguing, where does that get you?
Yeah, but apparently it's not a mental health question. So judging by the spread of these narratives, right? So actually, probably this would be the last question for our debate, not debate, discussion, conversation, as we put it, right? Do you feel that by studying conspiracy theories, you and memes as sort of another form, you are entering the new type of folklore? That you are a folklorist of kinds and sort of so what I know, Prop Buslaev did, collecting fairy tales and riddles and jokes, and the people now you dig into the depths of internet and you return with the full basket of material, and that is the folklore we are living in. Do you share this impression?
I have a couple of friends and colleagues who do folklore who told me I was an honorary folklorist, and I was so touched because I felt appreciated, but also because yes, especially the memes simply are modern folklore. There's just really I think there's nothing to be lost from thinking of memes in terms of folklore. Conspiracy theory it's more than folklore, but it is definitely folklore, absolutely. Yes, I think one of the things that always stopped me from being a folklorist is how uninterested I am in the folk. but this stuff has really grabbed me, and I think it's actually on the meme front, at least, it's really nice to see a resurgence, to see how all the stuff, like when I read Prop in grad school and all of that, actually not even in college, it all seems very nice, but very, very far from our lives, right? Except for, you know, I could do a Propian reading of Godzilla films. Actually, it worked very, very well. But it really seemed to be
That's your
about
background,
right, about kind of dead culture, and that might have been my mistake, but that's how it felt to me. And now it feels very much about live culture, and I think that is really fascinating. It's something that I think would have been difficult to predict, and is one of the more, despite everything one can say about it, one of the more charming features of the postmodern world.
It is indeed, and you're making it even more charming, and
Oh my goodness.
you're making it intelligible. That's a very important part. So since we don't have more questions, I think that it's a perfect timing for us to wrap it up, and I want to thank you so much for most interesting conversation and for your brilliant books, and we are looking forward to reading more. Please go on writing. That's fun for you, and it's education and fun for us all. Thank you, Eliot. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I can't imagine anyone I'd rather be talking with than you here. So this has been really great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.